understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time, and I woke up last night. Not so much in a cold sweat, but in a bit of a sweat. And John, I had two countervailing dreams, literally dreams. One was about Dublin 1.
You're on those mushrooms again.
I wasn't on the shrooms, man. Not at all. I was in bed early. I'd gone out and played a game of football in a little place called Sportsco, which is down beside Shelburne Dog Track. I was in bed early, and I woke up dreaming of Sheriff Street and Ardnanacrusha electrical station. But particularly Sheriff Street one remained in my head. And it was about the regeneration of Sheriff Street.
Right.
And it was
what were you doing? Hanging out?
I was hanging out thinking how Dublin 1 could be turned around dramatically. It was obviously something I was thinking about last night as I was going to bed, right?
Yeah.
And that's what today's podcast on Ardnanacrusha. Today's podcast is going to be on the very crucial idea, John, that really well-intentioned people who want to do really good things have wound themselves up in so many knots, such a lack of logic economic thinking that we have overburdened everything and we cannot achieve basic housing supply targets, basic housing price targets, basic climate change infrastructure, basic infrastructure when it comes to transport. And all the while, we are looking at the wrong culprits. We are identifying the wrong disease. And we are, in effect, getting in our own way when it comes to trying to rebuild, to build, to plan for the future, to expand our infrastructural networks. But ultimately, John, this is all about how do you deliver a reasonably decent quality of life for people at a reasonably decent price. That's what it's all about.
Well, come here. You mentioned Ardnanacrusha there. I mean, in the past, we've built big projects like Ardnanacrusha, as you mentioned, and Pool of Fuca, and we've built lots of housing back in the day. So how could we do it then and not now? What's different? What has changed?
Okay, a little reminder to some of our Irish listeners, but definitely many of our foreign listeners or our non-Irish listeners, right? Ardnanacrusha is a place where we were taken on national school tours when we were about 7 or 8 years old.
Yes.
On the back of very, very crowded buses, as I've said before.
With our egg sandwiches.
So our egg sandwiches, the Bang & Lilton Tato office, all the way down to Ardnanacrusha, which is outside Limerick, which is on the Shannon. And it is an extraordinary feat of public engineering. In 1927, when the Irish state was fledgling, and I say fledgling, we'd just come through a war of independence, a civil war. The democracy was fragile, but was maintained, which I think many Irish people fail to recognize as quite an achievement when the vast, vast, vast majority of European countries went either communist or fascist through the 1930s. This little place remained doggedly democratic, which in and of itself was an achievement. But what happened with the small new state was the small new state had a massive inferiority complex. And the massive inferiority complex came from the fact that it was a post-colonial state. We had no money, we had no energy, John, and we had no industry. We had what we call a beer and biscuits economy. So the only industry we had in Ireland was Guinnesses and Jacobs, both derivatives of agriculture. So there was no industrial base here. We were one of those places in Europe, unusual in Europe, that had absolutely no natural resources when it came to fossil fuels. So we had no coal, etc. So we had no domestic energy. So as a consequence of that, we didn't have an industrial revolution. Very simple.
Yeah.
So because the industrial revolution was all about happenstance and serendipity, if you happen to live over particularly a coal deposit, you therefore had the energy to burn to start creating industries largely built around smelting and largely built around steel. Of course, we had none of that. So what happened in Ireland was rather than people come to the industry in Ireland, Irish people went to the industry largely in the UK
Yeah.
and in the
Yeah.
United States. So that is one way of looking at the Irish story. So the new country emerges and we think, okay, we need to do something which not only creates a local domestic energy source based on hydroelectricity, because we have this large river called the Shannon, but also kind of sends a signal to our own people and the rest of the world that this new country is serious about the business of building a society around a reasonably modern economic structure based on energy. So what did they do? They said, okay, let us try and dam the Shannon. Let us try and create a hydroelectric facility, a dam, which will generate enough hydroelectric energy to power the electricity turbines, which was the new energy at the time, John.
Yeah.
That's the amazing thing. We forget that electricity was very, very new.
Yeah.
And our idea was that in some way, by building this hydroelectric facility, we will send a signal that we are a serious country, not just to our own people, but to outsiders as well. And of course, create what ended up being, and this is the most extraordinary thing, John, the world's most comprehensive electricity system based on renewable energy,
Yeah.
which was
Amazing.
achieved in 3 years. So it took 20% of GDP, of total revenue. Think about this, right?
That's
To
huge.
build a hydroelectric plant, which until the Hoover Dam was built in 1933, was the largest hydroelectric dam in the world.
Oh, really?
In the world.
Wow.
Before the Hoover Dam was built, right? So what you have, John, is a state imported the machinery from Siemens in Germany, because the Germans were the world's leading hydroelectric dam makers. The turbines were also imported from Germany. The labor was Irish, and they diverted the Shannon. And by 1934, think about this, 88% of all Ireland's electricity came from renewable energy. Now, just even imagine that now,
Yeah.
when we are now
We still had
burning.
blackouts though, didn't we?
Yeah, well, actually, we didn't have much. I mean, we were just,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
we also built a grid. Like we
Yeah.
built a grid using basic technology, which brought electricity to parts of the country, which basically brought light to parts of the country. And in
Yeah.
a way, what this said to lots of the farmers and the small farmers and the cottiers and the croppers and all that, like, we know you supported us in this war of independence. We know that you basically embraced a new republic, or not a new republic, a new free state. And in return, we have delivered you something, which is the magic of electricity. So there was kind of
Yeah.
a trade-off.
It's
This
amazing.
is sort of like, this is the social contract, you know?
But you know what? Siemens came back then in the 60s, and you were talking about school trips and stuff. I remember going on a school trip to Turlock Hill in Wicklow. And Turlock Hill is another amazing electricity generation plant built by Siemens, funded half by the World Bank at a total cost of 12 million quid. But I remember being blown away by this piece of engineering. So it's on Turlock Hill, on top of a mountain. There's a reservoir. They build a big tunnel down through the mountain with turbines in the middle. So they drop the water during the day down through the mountain into a reservoir at the bottom, and then at night pump it back up. An amazing
And just keep
piece of
doing it,
engineering.
and keep doing it, and
Yeah,
keep doing it.
completely renewable, amazing piece of engineering.
So the question you had is, why could we do that then
Yeah,
and not now? And just one extra little piece. We've spoken before in the podcast about John Gray. If you are walking up O'Connell Street, and if you want to see a man who, between Big Jim Larkin, one of the greatest windbags that Ireland ever suffered, okay,
Jesus.
and a complete windbag, right, and Daniel O'Connell, between them is an inconsequential statue of a man that nobody knows. John Gray did more for working class, poor Dubliners than Jim Larkin ever did, because he was the man who came up with a fresh water supply from Pulafuka, as you talked about,
Yeah,
from the reservoir in Wicklow, another reservoir in Wicklow. And to this day, when you turn on your tap anywhere in Dublin, the water that comes through your tap comes through, or at least some of it comes through, the same system that Gray installed in the 1870s, which is an
Wow.
extraordinary idea.
Yeah.
And this is the idea of cathedral building. Remember, we were talking about
Yeah.
plan over engineer, right? So the question is, not just in Ireland. I was in the UK last week. They were talking all about the new railway line. They can't seem to get it built. I was sitting beside a woman at dinner. She was saying, could you imagine if we were trying to build the M25 in the UK now? They
Yeah.
would never have built it. It's exactly the same in America. You have huge cost overruns in America. You have a massive housing problem and crisis in America. You have massive house price problem in America. All over the world, it's exactly the same. Like something has happened in the way in which Western countries run themselves over the last, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years, which seems to make us incapable, not unwilling, because people are willing, but
Mm.
incapable of building basic infrastructure. Now, the reason this is crucially important right now is because of the affordability crisis in housing. Now, your friend, Mr. Magaluf, central
Yes.
bank governor, was
Yes.
out yesterday in Ireland saying to the government, hold your horses with all your various different initiatives on housing. Why don't you look at the issue of zoning and planning as being a serious part of the problem? And again, what he's doing is he's focusing on what you would call, the Americans called progressive supply sideism, which I'll explain to you in 2
Right.
seconds.
Okay.
But you know that point we can't seem to build. I don't know if you've just seen the latest figures for Irish house prices.
Mm.
The latest figures, John, for house prices across Ireland, and this again, I come back to this is a problem all around the world, right? Is that house prices rose by an average of nearly 4% in the first 3 months of 2025.
Mm.
That means that inflation on house prices has reached the highest level in 8 years. The typical listed price on Daft is 346,000. That's the average. That's 11% higher than the year previously and 35% higher than at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Now,
Wow.
again,
Yeah.
over the years, there's various reasons as to why house prices increased, particularly before the last crash, John. The reason that house prices were increasing was far too much money was going into the housing market, pushing up the demand side of the equation. Now the problem is far too little houses are being built, and it's the supply side that is the problem. And today's podcast is all about how do we fix that?
Yeah, I mean, like, this is something I've been trying to get my head around. Like, where does the problem lie? Like, is it over politicized? This has become a political football, people scoring points against each other. Is it a lack of political will, or is it NIMBYism, or is it democracy where, you know, everybody has a say and is allowed to have a say, which is the right thing, I suppose, but it ends up being decisions by consensus, and therefore we never get anywhere, and it just
Okay,
stalls everything.
I think it's lots of things, John. I think that it isn't just politics. What
Right.
I get the impression is, and I've listened to various different politicians and I watch them on television and I kind of watch their body language as well, right? Is that lots of politicians have the best will in the world. I think if, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, or whoever happened to be in power here, or if it's Labour in the UK, or if it's the Republicans in the United States, if they could wave a magic wand and get 1 million houses built, they would.
Mm.
I think that what you have is, and I come back to this idea, well-intentioned people who don't understand basic economics, overburdening basic economics with some social, environmental, and political notions which have crippled the system so much that the system cannot deliver.
What do you mean? Like,
So by that I mean, here's a good example. Every right-minded person wants affordable houses. I hear it all the time,
yeah,
which is basically affordable houses means cheap houses. What we want is cheap houses, which are cheap enough for the average family or the average single person or the average couple or whoever it was to actually get a house which has got some reflection of a ratio to their income. Is it 3 times? Is it 4 times? Whatever it happens to be.
Mm.
As it was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So why has that changed dramatically? Now, you can say it's financialization and it's the banking system and it's the fact that we've turned houses into assets and into investments. Be that as it may, there is something else going on, John, which
Okay.
is at every turn, the very people, or sometimes the very people who talk about affordable housing, do things to the housing market to make houses unaffordable.
Such as what?
So basic principles are the following. Economics does what economics does, which is the way in which you reduce prices is you build more homes. That has always been the case. The way in which you make houses more affordable, more attainable, more achievable is you build more of them. Anything that you do that makes building houses more expensive is
Mm.
going to actually mitigate against your objective. So, take, for example, in Ireland, we have decided that in urban areas, we can go no higher than 8 stories.
Yeah.
That automatically means that you are going to increase the cost of houses built on that plot because you are minimizing the amount of homes that can be built there. That's an obvious no brainer, right?
Mm.
So, why not address that at the root cause? Second thing is the zoning of land. Ireland is, and I'm sick to the back teeth of saying it, Ireland is the least densely populated country in Western Europe
Yeah.
with the highest or amongst the highest house prices and land prices. That means there's something wrong with the basic infrastructure around building houses. So the first thing is to understand that a huge amount of the increase in house prices is due to regulation, whether it's building regulation, environmental regulation, and our planning restrictions, which minimize the amount of homes that can be built on that plot, and as a result, maximize the price to the final purchaser or
Yeah.
renter, who is the average citizen.
Yeah.
So the first thing is, and again, I come back to it, this is well-intentioned people doing stupid things with the best intentions, right? So it's not pointing the finger at people. It's basically the idea that over time, a combination of community initiatives, social objectives, environmental initiatives have overburdened housing and building so much so that the builder is no longer just the builder. The builder is now becomes the vehicle to achieve social objectives. So, for example, you say to a builder, look, in this new development, you've got to build 25% or 20% social housing.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to reduce the cost of social housing of those particular apartments. The builder says, fine, okay, I'll just have to increase the rest of the cost in order to do that. And then at the same time, what you do is you throw a huge amount of public money at the social side of the equation. What that does is it drives up the demand for social housing. It compels the developers to increase the price elsewhere. And ultimately, what it does, John, is I think, it absolves the state of the responsibility to provide housing for poorer people and puts that responsibility onto a private developer. And the private developer is therefore tied up in knots over something like this.
Yeah.
Give you another example. If you say to a private developer, and it's a really good objective, look, if you're building a block of apartments or whatever it happens to be, you also have to build a public park or a kid's playground or whatever you decide is
Mm.
the social objective, right? Now, again, all that does is that increases the price to the final purchaser. Okay. Why not just say to the builder, you just build the basic houses and we'll build the basic infrastructure. So the state will build out of general taxation. You do your thing, we'll do our thing, we'll work together, we'll figure it all out. But you know what? We will not be in the business of passing on costs of social objectives to final purchasers of houses because they are already at the pin of their collar.
Yeah.
And we will not also encumber you, the developer or the builder, with doing all these things because you are saying that, yeah, I can do all that stuff, but you're going to actually see that in the final price. So the idea would be That's not just on housing.
Mm.
Take, for example, climate change, right? You and I, almost everyone says, yeah, climate change, pretty bad thing. We should fight against it and we should try and achieve our climate
Yeah.
targets. Now, what does
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
mean? That means what we should do is we should be moving back to an Ardnanacrusha style development where all electricity generating is renewable, right? And we're moving away from fossil fuel burning. Number one, because it's bad for the environment. But number two, also in Ireland, is because it actually leaves you very exposed at the end of a gas line to
Yeah.
all sorts of heists, corruptions, political interference, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, but
Okay.
can I just make the point that, Ardnacrusha or Turlock Hill or any of those electricity plants weren't built with the environment in mind, really. They were built because they were the most efficient thing to do at the time and the best option at the time.
That's exactly what I'm saying to you. The state says just build these things,
Yeah.
right?
But if
We
if
will.
if it was cheaper or easier to build a coal-fired power station, well, then they would have done that, you know?
They would have done that, but we didn't have that.
But
So
now we have the kind of complication of environmental issues. And also, as we've always said before, it's one thing about the environmental movement that kind of bothers me is you've always said about the left. The left always looks for traitors while the right looks for converts. The environmental movement is more or less the same. If you're concerned about green issues, you need to be concerned about all green issues.
I
So,
know
you're not green enough, whether it's snails or bats or whatever it is. And you need to keep things in perspective.
exactly. So the well-intentioned are getting in their own way. This is back to
Yes.
the idea, right?
Yes, exactly.
So take, for example, snails, frogs, all that sort of stuff, right? In Ireland and in many, many Western countries, not only are the snails and frogs and these things, which we should always worry about,
Sure.
right?
Absolutely.
But in Ireland, there is a legal system, which means an objector can go to court and force the developer to prove that the developer is not affecting endangered species,
Mm,
as opposed to just setting in a law say you cannot build here because it's an endangered species.
yeah.
Done. Identifying where we can and cannot build and just saying no building there.
Yeah.
Whereas in Ireland, what we have is it's so opaque and it's such a nod and wink system. Somebody can say this particular development is endangering this particular species. And you know what? I can go to court and it's not up to me to prove that the species is endangered. It's up to you to prove that you're not doing it.
Yes.
Now think about how
Yeah.
much time that takes.
Yes.
Think
Yeah.
about the legal system, right? So this is just, again, I've got, lots and lots of people I know who, for example, are very environmentally aware, but object to wind farms off the coast. So they don't like the
Yeah.
look of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Or they're very environmentally aware, but they object to wind farms on the hillsides because they
Yeah.
don't like the look of them. So you cannot achieve your environmental targets, which you as a well-intentioned person wants to achieve,
Mm,
if you encumber all the initiatives, the infrastructure with environmental caveats.
yeah.
And in some cases, these things are nothing more than the private desire for a better view or the private desire not to have that stuff built beside me.
Absolutely. I think I've told you before, when I was in Spain, I was staying in a place which was a national park, which was full of wind farms. And
Yeah.
it looked fantastic. They stand out, but it works because, hey, we live in a modern world. Norway is full of wind farms on hilltops. It's the most beautiful country in the world. People just get on with it. It
And
works.
Ireland, which has more natural wind than almost anywhere. I think it's ourselves and the Scots have the most consistent wind. We know the wind farm is a problem because when the wind
Mm,
doesn't blow, you don't have energy. But that is not a problem. That is only a feature of wind energy. But
yeah,
our problem is NIMBYism. Our
yeah,
problem is the state, because it's afeard of NIMBYism, isn't even building the grid and even isn't engaging the companies that can build the grids to do that thing. So, for example, like all large infrastructure projects are very capital intensive. You can only build large infrastructure projects if the state reduces the risk in some shape or form.
Mm.
So if the state, for example, says, okay, well, if you build this big infrastructural grid on the West Coast, we will guarantee you a price of electricity, which you can feed into your models, and that will generate the revenue, which will generate enough money for you to pay back the interest rate on the massive capital investment of all the capital you've borrowed. I mean, this
Yeah.
is not difficult stuff, but it's not been done.
Yeah. So is NIMBYism democracy gone wrong?
It's too much democracy, John. It's
Too
called,
much.
it's what I would call hyper democracy.
Yeah.
And again, it comes down to the basic idea at the heart of macroeconomics. Paradox of aggregation, John, our friend.
Yes.
What is good for the individual is not always good for the collective. So, for example, if the individual complains that the wind farm, in this case, we're discussing wind farms, impedes his or her view or her aesthetic or whatever it happens to be,
Mm.
and she or he manages to impede, to retard, or in some way to even eliminate the development of wind farms, and we're just talking about wind farms here, what you get is what is good for her or him is very bad for the collective, because the
Yeah.
collective doesn't get the wind farm, number one. We don't get the autonomy in Irish energy or American energy, wherever you are, number two. And number three, it makes you more and more susceptible to and dependent on fossil fuels. Who are the biggest suppliers of fossil fuels in the world? Our friends, the Russians,
Mm.
the Saudis. These
Yeah.
guys are, now that the world has changed, the Americans. And you're
Yeah.
basically back dependent on America. And as we saw from the very recent transcripts, John, of our old friend of the show, Jeff Goldberg, yesterday,
Yes. Yes.
where basically the Americans were saying, what is the transactional cost of us bombing the Houthis? How much are we going to extract from the Europeans? Because it's the European trade that actually is most affected by the Red Sea. So what
Yeah.
you have is a transactional mindset. So the last thing you want to be doing is uber dependent on those people for your LPG.
Yeah.
So that's where we're going with this. You know, it's this is big stuff. And again, we're talking about the inherent contradictions of well-intentioned people getting in their own way.
You know, it's interesting, Mac. I was talking to a friend of mine, Brian Cullen, in LA about this kind of stuff. He runs an infrastructure construction company over there, Vico Infrastructure, that specialize in particularly water infrastructure. And we must get him on the show, actually. But
Cool.
I was asking him about how LA is going to handle the rebuilding of certain parts of LA after the fires. But he was saying that it's more or less the same story over there, that people want good infrastructure, but they're not prepared to pay for it.
Or it's not even, John, that nobody wants to pay for it. We can't pay for it at the cost. When you overburden
Yeah.
the infrastructural cost with all sorts of what I would call social, environmental, and societal objectives, which are anointed by well-intended people,
Yeah.
what you do is you increase the foundational price of building, and that translates into less stuff being built and higher prices, and a crisis which could have been dealt with ends up being a tragedy, which is what we're facing in the housing market.
Okay, so how do we fix this? But before you answer that, let's do a bit of this. So, Mac, we're talking about building an infrastructure and how we can't get out of our own way in terms of actually building affordable housing or proper infrastructure. How do we fix this?
Well, the first thing is, do you remember the expression that we talked about a long, long time ago of the very wise man Deng Xiaoping?
Yes.
Deng Xiaoping was the man who brought the really kind of crazy cultural revolution period of Mao Zedong, and then Mao Zedong's wife, the Gang of Four, and all that stuff. Deng Xiaoping was the man who brought that all to an end and said, look, hold on a second. China needs to open up. We need to build. We need to become prosperous. We need to give our people the quality of life that they deserve, frankly. And we've looked around the world and we are not achieving. But he said something. He said, I don't care what color cat it is, as long as the cat catches mice. Do you remember he said that?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And what he was basically saying, speaking in that slightly Confucian way that Chinese leaders do, is he was saying, look, you know what? I don't care if it's right or left. I don't care about the ideology. I just care about the outcomes, the results.
Yeah, yeah.
So we need to take that idea. The state needs to take that idea that it doesn't really matter if ideas come from the left or the right or liberals or progressives or, whoever, right? As long as they work, as long as they achieve the results that we want. So what results do we want to achieve? We want to achieve, for example, you take in Ireland, right? More houses, a better public infrastructure, trains that work on time, that connect places together so that the economy and the society becomes much smaller. Therefore, commuting becomes less of a hassle. People have a much higher quality of life, can live out in the countryside,
Yeah.
commuting to Dublin, Belfast, Cork, whatever it happens to be. Same thing for the UK, same thing for the States, same thing for everywhere in Europe, right? So how do you do that? You take the best practice, no matter where that is, and you reimpose it here. So, for example, we did a podcast about, it's a good few years ago now, John, where we highlighted the fact that in Italy and in Spain, but particularly in Italy, the cost of drilling, building tunnels, building metros is not half of Ireland, not 70% of Ireland, but is 1/10 of the cost.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what you do is you take that blueprint and you say, what are they not overburdening on their projects to allow them to build things much cheaper? Because energy prices should, in general, be the same as Ireland and Italy. And energy is one of the massive, massive inputs into building, for example, a metro. Because you need to build tunnels, you
Yeah.
need to
Yeah.
generate the power to do that. Second thing, wages. Are Irish wages so much higher than Italian wages? They're definitely higher than Italian wages, but are they 10 times more? No, they're not. So your two foundational costs. Thirdly, then, is it an issue of how you zone or how you restrict buildings? If it is, get rid of those restrictions, get rid of those zoning impediments. Fourthly, is it a reflection of the legal system so that, to come back to our idea, John, of what is good for the individual is not always good for the collective, so that small, highly organized groups of concerned residents can hold up a project for years and years and years? If that's the case, change the legal system.
Yes.
Create special purpose vehicles that can obscure the legal system or work around the legal system so that, yes, you can object, but you can object at the start of the project and then no more. Things like, for example, in the case with Ireland, I can object to a development in Donegal even though I live in Dublin.
Yes. Yeah.
And
that's
lots
bonkers.
and lots of object,
Absolute
right?
bonkers.
So the only people who can object are people who are actually living within a square mile or half a mile. So people who are materially impacted negatively of something, right? So what you do is you just go through a checklist, and what you explain to well-intentioned people is, we are doing this for you.
Yeah.
To achieve your objectives. Because if we don't do this for you, we are going to have a housing crisis into perpetuity. What this is going to do to you is it means your kids are going to emigrate because they can never actually get a place to live. And what it means for you is that your NIMBYism, not in my backyard, makes the place you live a barren, dead place. The reason that NIMBYism is interesting is people make communities. If you decide that people are the enemy, no matter what type of people you think are the enemy, if you decide that people are the enemy, then your community is just going to die. It's going to become atrophied. You walk around the center of Dublin, for example, you walk around Merrion Square around there. Again, this is very Dublin centric. I accept that, and apologies in advance, but there are no people there at night.
Yeah.
So there's no life
Yeah.
because they're all bloody office blocks.
Yeah.
And there's no life, and there's no restaurants, there's no bars, there's no nada, right? And they don't even look pretty because they look empty. And again, if you go back to even, for example, urban blight, and this comes back to my obsession last night as I woke up in the middle of the night thinking of Sheriff Street and Dublin 1, is that the only thing that makes places safe are eyes on the street, not cops, not security. What makes areas actually safe are people, because people look after their own porch. People look after their own front garden.
Yeah.
People look after their own area, and they police themselves. And the reason streets are dangerous and scary and intimidating is the streets are empty and
Mm.
they're dark and they've nobody on it. Whereas when you, for example, arrive in a street that's incredibly busy and there's stuff going on and day and night, nobody feels intimidated
Yeah.
because everybody feels safe because everyone's looking after themselves.
But I do get the feeling that these significant changes in, regulations and planning and the legal system, and like they're substantial changes. I do get the feeling that politicians are more interested in the business of politics rather than making these proper changes.
I think they might be, and I think that's a very cynical point of view, Mr. Davis. It's a very cynical point of view.
Can't help
No,
it.
I think that, and we'll conclude here, that we need a complete and utter shake-up in the way in which we run our countries. And I said countries, not country. That something has happened over the last 30 years which has made states incapable of building what they want, where they want, when they want, at the right price. So every single government department in every single Western country is full of beautiful brochures with images of trains going from X and Y and high-speed
Yeah.
rails and all that stuff, but it's never built. You go to China, they're building this stuff, right?
Yeah.
You go to Italy, they've built this stuff. So it's not necessarily just a democratic thing. It's about how you build. If Ireland wants to be a proper 21st century country, the key issue, John, is speed. Why in the past were things built so quickly, whereas now they take years and years to build? And why that years and years is a deadweight cost to society, to the economy, to the people. We all get old. If you
Mm.
look at, for example, let's leave John, the Empire State Building was the most impressive building ever built, the tallest skyscraper in America,
Yeah.
built in 1931, and was built in less than 2 years. The whole thing, from start
Was
to
it?
finish.
Wow.
From start to finish. So it's that idea of speed. So the question then is, how do we accelerate into the future? It's not good enough just to say, we're just going to divide up bits of the present into the future, and that's what we're going to do. No, we
Yeah.
have to reinvent the future. We have to accelerate into the future. And the way in which you accelerate is you reduce the impediments to acceleration, which are no longer about money. They used to be in the old days. Ireland didn't have the money, so we couldn't do things. They're no longer about money. They're no longer about technical ability, because we all have the technical ability. They're no longer about capital and the technology, because we can import it. What it is, it's about the system that we have created. And that system maybe only can be imploded, John, by the declaration of a new republic, a second republic, where
Oh.
we change the whole thing. We change the constitution. We change the way in which we look at the legal system. And what we do is we're changing the republic to, in some way, make the future attainable. At the moment, we have a constitution which is encumbered by all sorts of various caveats and legalities and restrictions and requirements and all that sort of stuff, which allows the system to gum itself up, which allows the people to get in their own way, and which allows these extraordinary delays and course overruns, and frankly, the underachievement of a society given its wealth. It's time now, John. As I said before, the French had a fifth republic. They'll probably have a sixth republic before next year. Let's just have a second Irish republic and take it from there.